The village of High Meadow had always prided itself on its quiet charm, a place of clipped hedgerows, old stone cottages, and the gentle ringing of the church bell that marked the passing of hours as softly as a lullaby. One might have said, looking upon it from the sloping hill where the manor gardens rested, that it was the sort of place where nothing of consequence ever happened. But that, as Miss Marple often noted when sipping her afternoon tea, was precisely the sort of village where everything happened. Simply behind lace curtains, the evening in question had begun like any other. The golden light of late summer gathered in warm pools across the cobblestones, and a faint breeze carried the scent of lavender from Mrs. Pembroke's well-tended border. The village post office had just shut its red wooden door for the night, and a scattering of townsfolk were returning home from the weekly book club at the vicarage. Miss Marple sat in her usual spot, a small wicker chair by the window of her cozy sitting room. A soft lamp illuminated her knitting, though she had long since ceased paying attention to the pattern. Her thoughtful eyes, pale and clear as winter sky, rested instead on the village street. She saw everything without appearing to look at all. That was why she noticed the young man first. He hurried along the lane with a troubled urgency quite out of place in High Meadow. He paused beneath the lamplight near the post office, glanced around, and slipped a large envelope into the after-hours mail slot. The movement was sharp, secretive, the kind of action one hopes no one has seen. Miss Marple watched him retreat into the dark, her needles clicking faintly. That will be the beginning of something, she murmured to herself. She had lived long enough to know the difference between ordinary mail and mail sent at night. Not an hour later, as the moon rose full and pale behind the church steeple, the village was stirred by a sound far more unsettling, a woman's shrieking sobs echoing across the green. It was Mrs. Clara Vennings, the recent widow who had moved into Rose Cottage only 8 months prior. A timid, soft-spoken lady of perhaps 57, with kind eyes and a habit of wearing cardigans too large for her small frame. Since her husband's passing, she had been seen mainly in the company of her cat and the village librarian, so it was with great astonishment that the villagers now watched as she ran down the road. Night shawl flung about her shoulders, hair unpinned and wild. She clutched a single sheet of paper in her trembling hand. "They told me he was dead," she cried. "They told me he was gone. But he wrote. He wrote to me. Tonight, tonight." Her voice broke into a kind of desperate keening. Doors opened. Lamps flickered on. Slippers shuffled against stone. The village gathered, a half-circle of curious faces. "Calm yourself, Mrs. Vennings," called Mr. Fletcher, the grocer, though his tone suggested he very much did not want her calm. "What letter is this?" She held it out with shaking fingers. The handwriting was unmistakably that of her late husband. Bold strokes, looping capitals, a flourish on the final letters, and the date, stamped only the day before. Whispers broke out like gusts of wind through the trees. But Harold Vennings died last spring, buried right there in St. Albans churchyard. God preserve us. Mrs. Vennings pressed the paper to her chest. "He is alive," she said, voice trembling with terror and hope all at once. "Or someone wants me to believe he is." It was then, quietly, gently, that Miss Marple stepped forward from the small crowd. "My dear," she said, with a kindness that steadied more than any hand could have. "May I see the letter?" The widow hesitated only a moment, then gave it to her. Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly over the page. Her face revealed nothing, but there was something in the way she studied the ink spacing, the crease in the fold, the faint smudge near the signature. Not shock, not disbelief, recognition. She murmured softly. "Yes, This is very interesting indeed. No one dared speak. The night air thickened, heavy with something unspoken. Finally, Miss Marple lifted her gaze. "I believe," she said quietly, "that someone very much wishes Mrs. Vennings to suffer, and that," she paused, her voice as soft as velvet, "is seldom without reason." Around her, the villagers shifted uneasily, because in High Meadow, where everyone claimed to know everyone, it was suddenly clear someone was lying. And someone was very good at it. The village, until this very moment, so peaceful, had just stepped quietly into the beginning of a mystery. The murmurs did not quiet all at once, but rather faded in rippling waves as the villagers dispersed back to their homes. Even as they walked away, they continued to glance over their shoulders, whispering to one another with an eagerness sharpened by fear. Word would travel quickly through High Meadow, each retelling adding a shade of speculation, a touch of embellishment, like a painting reworked until the truth lay nearly unrecognizable beneath layers of imagination. Miss Marple, however, returned to her cottage with measured steps. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her small reticule bag, promising Mrs. Vennings she would return it to her after a more proper examination, and suggesting, with gentle firmness, that the poor widow rest. Mrs. Vennings nodded, though her eyes remained glazed, her mind clearly entangled with more possibilities than she dared voice aloud. She clutched her shawl close, as one holds something dear against a sudden wind. Inside her parlor, Miss Marple lit a single lamp. The room was warm, full of quiet floral patterns and well-loved books. But tonight, it held the faint weight of disturbance. A shift in the air when something previously settled has begun to stir. She laid the letter upon the small writing desk and studied it once more. The ink, well dried. The paper, ordinary. The handwriting, yes, very like Harold Vennings. Yet Miss Marple had not lived this long without understanding that handwriting could be imitated, and memories could be manipulated when grief was fresh and raw. She kept thinking of the young man who had posted the envelope after dusk. His haste, his glance over the shoulder. He had not looked familiar, not one of High Meadow's usual figures. Something about his gait suggested he did not belong. She would need to make discreet inquiries, but first there would be the morning. High Meadow awoke to gossip, as surely as it awoke to the sunrise. By 8 o'clock, Mrs. Pembroke was already on her second visit to the Green, where she met Mrs. Chatterby, who had of course seen Clara Vennings from her window, and who had of course been just thinking that Clara had looked unusually pale the week prior, which surely meant something. Mr. Fletcher, at the grocer's, recounted the widow's cries with a flourish so dramatic that 3 customers forgot entirely what they had come to buy. Even the vicar, who preferred to distance himself from idle talk, found himself approached more than once that morning by concerned parishioners asking, softly, politely, whether the dead might write letters under certain spiritual circumstances. Miss Marple let all of this run its course. She knew it would soon settle into pattern, and patterns were much easier to read. Late in the morning, she made her way to Rose Cottage. Clara Vennings answered the door herself, though her posture was not as distressed as the night before. There was a strained composure to her now, as though she had been up for hours wrestling with her thoughts. "I hoped you would come," she said, stepping aside. The sitting room was modest, the curtains partially drawn. A framed photograph of Harold Vennings rested on the mantel, a pleasant-faced man with large spectacles and a rather gentle smile. Clara's eyes flickered toward it often. "He was not a remarkable man," she said quietly, without prompting. "Not the sort people remember. But he was good. He was steady." Her voice caught. When he fell ill, I thought it was simply one of those things that happens. And then, gone, just gone. And now this. Miss Marple listened without interruption, only the faintest nod acknowledging her sympathy. "Clara, my dear," she said gently, "was there anyone at all, who stood to gain from your husband's passing? Financially, socially, personally?" The question lingered. Clara's hands tightened around the edge of her teacup. "There was Ronald Avery," she said finally. "Harold's business partner. The two had a disagreement, not long before Harold took ill. A rather bitter one, I believe. Harold spoke of ending their association entirely, but Ronald managed the accounts. I never knew the details." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, though something thoughtful moved behind her eyes. "And you have seen Mr. Avery since your husband's passing?" "Yes," Clara whispered. "He paid condolences. He brought flowers. He was kind. Too kind, perhaps. He suggested I sell the business interests. He offered to handle everything. I trusted him." Miss Marple understood. Grief could make a person lean heavily on the nearest, seemingly steady hand. Before Clara could say more, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, rapid, insistent. Clara flinched. "Come in," she called shakily. The door opened, and Ronald Avery himself stepped into the room. A man in his early 60s, neatly dressed, dark hair graying at the temples, with a look of practiced sympathy softening his features. "Clara," he said with grave politeness, "I came as soon as I heard. This business about the letter, it must not disturb you further. I assure you, there is some rational explanation. Perhaps an old draft Harold forgot to send." His eyes flickered then, just for the briefest moment, toward Miss Marple. Surprise, then calculation, and Miss Marple. He added smoothly, "I hadn't realized you were involved." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, I am not involved," she said lightly, "merely visiting a friend." But her eyes, the soft, wise, unassuming eyes of an elderly woman in lace cuffs, never once left his face. It was only a moment, a blink of time, but Miss Marple, who had observed hundreds of such moments in her life, saw something unmistakable. Ronald Avery was afraid, not of ghosts, of something much worse, being found out. Ronald Avery's polite smile did not quite reach his eyes. He took a seat uninvited, his movements smooth and practiced, as though he had done so here many times before. Clara watched him with a mixture of gratitude and unease, hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "It has all been rather upsetting," Clara murmured, her voice tight. "The letter, I mean. I hardly slept." Ronald leaned forward with a reassuring air that seemed slightly too polished. "My dear Clara, grief can take many forms. Sometimes the mind plays tricks, especially at night. Harold's memory is still very raw for you." Miss Marple, sitting quite comfortably in the corner, offered no interruption. She simply watched, knitting resting loosely on her lap, her attention as light and unobtrusive as dust on a windowsill. "But the letter is real," Clara whispered. The handwriting, the tone. "Ronald, it was his." Ronald's hand stilled for the briefest instant. Only someone watching very closely, someone like Miss Marple, would notice it. Then he gave a small laugh, one shade too controlled. "Handwriting can be copied. There are people who can forge with remarkable accuracy." His tone remained easy, but the words were chosen with deliberate care. What matters is not how it looks, but where it came from. Postmarked in town, they say. Anyone could have posted it. Miss Marple tilted her head very slightly. "Yes," she said softly, "although it is interesting that it was posted at such an hour, and by someone not usually seen in High Meadow." Both Clara and Ronald turned to look at her. "A young man," Miss Marple continued mildly as though describing the weather, dark-haired, somewhat hurried in his demeanor. He did not look like one of our villagers, which suggests he came with purpose rather than coincidence. Ronald's expression shifted, just a flicker, something like annoyance masked by concern. "You saw him?" he asked. "I did," Miss Marple replied, polite as ever. "I make a habit of noticing things. One never knows when they become useful." Clara let out a slow breath, something within her tightening. "If someone sent this to torment me," she murmured. "Why? Who would wish to cause such distress?" Ronald placed a deliberate hand on hers. "That is exactly what I intend to discover," he said smoothly. "Clara, I will handle the matter. Leave it to me. You should rest." It was kindly said, but there was a weight to it, a quiet insistence, a suggestion, almost, of ownership. Miss Marple rose, gathering her knitting bag. "Clara, I shall call again later, perhaps around tea time," she said gently. "We will talk more then." Clara nodded, visibly steadier simply at Miss Marple's presence. Ronald stood as well, though his eyes followed Miss Marple with a measured watchfulness, the sort a man develops when accustomed to controlling a situation and has just realized he may no longer be fully doing so. Miss Marple stepped out into the fresh morning air. The sun was bright now, but the village felt shaded by something unseen. She did not hurry. She rarely did. Her pace was calm, thoughtful. She walked toward the post office. Inside, Mrs. Harrow, the postmistress, was sorting envelopes into tidy piles, a woman of brisk movements and sharper opinions. She greeted Miss Marple with her usual mixture of suspicion and interest. "Morning, Miss Marple. Busy already, are we?" "Oh, just a small inquiry," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "About the after-hours post last night. I believe a piece of mail was deposited rather late. Might you recall anything?" Mrs. Harrow sniffed with mild indignation. "Middle of the night, that one. I heard the slot. I was still awake. Too much tea before bed. Didn't see the fellow myself, though. But—" she lowered her voice conspiratorially. "He wasn't from here. Had that city snap in his walk. Not the sort to nod to neighbors." Miss Marple's eyes warmed with polite gratitude. "Thank you. Most helpful." She stepped back outside. The breeze rustled leaves in the churchyard. A robin darted across the path. Life went on, as it always did, even when a quiet game had begun beneath the surface. She had learned enough to know this. Someone in High Meadow had called in help. Someone who needed something done without being seen. And Harold Vennings, the quiet, steady man with the gentle smile, had not left his wife as peacefully as the village believed. Miss Marple continued her walk, her expression serene. Inside her mind, however, the pattern was already forming, and patterns, once seen, were very difficult to hide. Miss Marple continued along the lane until she reached the churchyard. The graves lay in gentle rows beneath the yew trees, shadows lying soft across the grass, like folded blankets. She paused before Harold Vennings's headstone, a modest gray slate, plain lettering, nothing ostentatious. The flowers placed there were fresh. Someone had visited recently, more than once, judging by the replaced stems. She bent slightly, as though adjusting her shawl, though her sharp eyes were examining the ground. The grass was slightly flattened in two places, one at Clara's height, and another set of footprints, larger, heavier, a man, recently within the last day or two. She straightened again, nodding to herself. There was a sound of footsteps on gravel behind her. The vicar approached, hands clasped, coat slightly flapping in the morning breeze. He was a nervous man, kind, but always seeming to be in fear of distressing someone unintentionally. "Miss Marple," he said with gentle surprise. "Visiting Harold?" "Just passing by," Miss Marple replied softly. "Though I was wondering. Clara has been here often, I assume." "Oh, yes," the vicar sighed. every day. Sometimes twice. It is difficult for her. She clings to memory, as some cling to prayer. And now this letter. His voice dimmed to something troubled. I fear it may do her more harm than comfort. She is a gentle soul, Miss Marple agreed, and gentle souls are easily unsettled, though grief can be a strange teacher. It tells us things we might otherwise overlook. The vicar hesitated, shifting his gaze away. There is something I did not mention to Clara, he admitted, something I noticed some weeks after the funeral. It may be nothing, or perhaps it is something, after all. Miss Marple waited. Silence, she knew, was as useful as any question. Someone had been removing items from Harold's grave. Small things, mostly. A ribbon Clara had left, a small wooden carving, a pressed flower. Not all at once, but gradually. At first I thought perhaps the wind or birds, but the pattern was too careful, as though someone did not want the grave to have sentiment. The breeze moved across the grass again, cool and thoughtful. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. And did Clara know this? No. The vicar's face was pained. I feared it would break her. Miss Marple nodded. You did what you believed kind, and kindness, even when imperfect, is never wasted. She thanked him and walked on. Her steps were unhurried, but her mind was moving swiftly now. Someone had tampered with Harold's memory. First removing tokens from his grave, now sending a letter that tore open grief like a wound. This was not chance. This was deliberate. She made her way toward the high street, where the village inn, the Willow and Heart, sat quietly with its faded green sign swinging in a faint breeze. A few patrons lingered outside, smoking leisurely, hats tipped low. Among them, Miss Marple noticed a new face. A man sitting alone at a side table, collar turned up, watching the road instead of his drink, not from the village, not comfortable, waiting for something. Miss Marple stepped inside instead, where the atmosphere smelled of tea and hearth embers. She greeted the innkeeper, Mr. Daltrey, who knew every traveler who had stayed longer than a night. Good morning, Mr. Daltrey. A small curiosity. Have you had any new lodgers lately? Someone quiet, perhaps not wishing to draw attention. Mr. Daltrey lowered his spectacles, thoughtful. Well now, funny you ask. There's a young fellow arrived 3 days ago. Keeps to himself, pays in cash, doesn't give trouble, didn't give a reason for staying, and I learned long ago not to pry when money's good. Miss Marple smiled warmly. Oh, I'm sure. Men who don't wish to be noticed usually have something on their minds. You've always had a good instinct for character, Mr. Daltrey. He looked pleased by the compliment, as she knew he would. She thanked him and left quietly, neither hurrying nor lingering. Outside, the young man was gone from the table, but the glass of his unfinished drink still sat there, condensation gathering in slow droplets. Someone else was moving now, someone who did not wish to be seen. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and continued down the lane, her eyes thoughtful. The pattern was no longer faint. It was becoming very clear, but clarity, in matters such as these, must be approached gently. For the moment one sees the truth begins to react. She would need to move with care now. Very careful care. Miss Marple did not return directly home. Instead, she took the long way round through Market Lane, where she could observe without seeming to. The village was small, and its rhythms were familiar. Any disruption in the pattern was as clear to her as a snag in her knitting. Today, there were several such snags. At the end of Market Lane, near the old stone bridge, she saw the young man again. He was standing with his back to the village, looking toward the fields, as if considering a route out. He had the look of someone who wished to disappear, but had not yet worked out where to disappear to. Miss Marple watched him only for a moment, She made no move to approach. One does not tug on a loose thread too quickly. It is best to let it unravel of its own weight. Instead, she continued on to her cottage, where she made tea and sat quietly for a time. There was no hurry. Mysteries, she believed, were like cream left to settle. Disturb them too soon, and the truth clouded. She spent the next hour examining the letter more closely. The signature was convincing. The phrasing was gentle, affectionate, distinctly Harold's tone. But the date, yes, the date was the thing. Handwritten, not printed, and the stamp had been affixed slightly askew, unlike Harold's habit of neat corners. Someone who knew his handwriting well, but not his small habits. Someone who had seen enough of it to copy, but not enough to imitate perfectly. She placed the letter down and looked out the window. The afternoon sun had shifted. It was time. Clara had likely spent the day in a haze of shock and questioning. Such a state made the mind too vulnerable to persuasion, especially from someone like Ronald Avery, who had already established himself as her guide, her steadying force. Miss Marple arrived again at Rose Cottage just as Ronald was leaving. His expression was calm, but his stride was tight, clipped, purposeful in a way that suggested something had not gone entirely as he wished. He paused when he saw her, masking his reaction almost instantly. "Miss Marple," he greeted cordially. "Still occupied with all this? I assure you, it is nothing worth troubling over. Clara simply needs rest." Miss Marple gave him her gentlest, most grandmotherly smile. "Oh, I quite agree, and I believe rest will come more easily when certain small uncertainties are cleared. You see, I find the mind settles wonderfully when truth is brought to light." For a brief, flickering second, Ronald's jaw tightened. Then he tipped his hat, murmured a polite farewell, and walked off at a brisk pace, as though he had somewhere very important to be, or something very important to check. Miss Marple watched him go, then entered. Clara was seated in her small parlor, the letter spread on the table before her, hands clasped together tightly. She looked up with grateful relief. "I'm glad you came," she whispered. "I feel as though I am losing my sense of what is real." Miss Marple sat beside her, taking her hand lightly. "My dear, you are not losing anything. You are simply seeing what others wished you not to see." Clara's voice broke. "Do you think he could still be alive? Harold? Could he have been taken away for some reason? Some danger?" Miss Marple shook her head very gently. "No, Harold Vennings is gone. You loved him dearly, and he loved you. But his peace was real. What is being done now is not to restore him, but to use him." Clara's breath caught, fragile as glass. "Use him?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "To control you, to silence questions, to make decisions easier for someone else." Something inside Clara steadied, pain becoming clarity, sorrow turning to something sharper. She nodded slowly. "Ronald," she whispered. Miss Marple did not confirm. She did not need to. The human heart, when guided by truth, recognizes its own conclusions. There was a knock at the door. Hesitant, uncertain, Clara stiffened. Miss Marple placed a calming hand over hers and went to answer it. On the doorstep stood the young man. Up close, he was not much older than 30. His coat was worn, his eyes wary yet troubled, as though he carried guilt heavy in his pockets. "Mrs. Vennings?" he asked, voice rough. Miss Marple answered for her, kindly. "She is resting, but you may speak to me." The young man swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have been part of this," he murmured. "I didn't know what it meant. They told me to send the letter, said it would help her, but it didn't look right, and when I heard her crying last night." His voice cracked. He shook his head. "I can't stay quiet. I need to tell someone." Miss Marple stepped back just enough to let him inside. There it was. Not confession yet, but the first crack in the wall, and once a wall begins to crack, the truth has a way of pouring through. The young man stepped into the sitting room as though crossing a threshold he could never return from. His hands trembled. He clasped them together to hide it, but the effort only made the shaking more apparent. Clara watched him with wide, wounded eyes, her grief sharpening into something like fragile dread. Miss Marple motioned gently toward a chair. He sat. It was Mr. Avery. He began, voice low, not meeting their eyes. He contacted me 2 weeks ago. I do odd copying work, penmanship, documents, address cards. He said he needed someone who could imitate handwriting. Nothing illegal, he said. Just sentimental. Just a comfort. The young man swallowed hard. I didn't know it was meant for her. I swear I didn't. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. And the letter? Miss Marple asked softly. He gave me old samples, notes, ledger entries, and one birthday letter Harold wrote years ago. Said a widow needed closure. Said it would help her heal. That it would be kinder this way. He drew a shaky breath. But once I wrote it, he looked satisfied, too satisfied, not relieved, not sorrowful, just pleased with himself. Miss Marple watched him carefully. He was frightened, yes, but not of them. He was frightened of what he had now seen. And you posted it last night, Miss Marple said, under instructions. Yes, he said it had to be late, unnoticed. The young man ran a hand over his face. But when I heard her, when I saw her in the street, crying, I realized it wasn't kindness. It was cruelty. Clara's voice was barely audible. Why would he do such a thing to me? The young man opened his mouth, but Miss Marple raised a hand gently, stopping him. She had seen the direction this question must go, and it required care. Tell me, she said, still calm, still grandmotherly, when Mr. Avery gave you the original handwriting samples, did he say where he obtained them? Yes, the young man said. He said they came from Harold's personal belongings, boxes of paperwork that Clara had agreed to let him sort through after the death. He made it sound very normal. Clara closed her eyes. I did let him. I asked him to. I trusted him with everything I could not bear to face myself. Miss Marple nodded. That, she had suspected. The young man continued. There was something else, a draft, a letter Harold had written before he died, to Clara. I only saw a few lines while filing, but it didn't say anything like illness or peace. It said, he hesitated, visibly shaken. What did it say? Miss Marple asked quietly. That he was afraid. The young man whispered, afraid of someone, afraid he had discovered something he couldn't undo. The room went still. Even the faint ticking of the mantel clock seemed to pause. Clara looked numb now, not shocked, not crying, numb, as though her heart had temporarily shut itself to survive. Miss Marple reached out and placed her hand lightly atop Clara's own. My dear, she said softly, you must understand something very clearly. Harold did not leave you peacefully. His final days held fear, and someone wished to ensure that fear remained buried. Clara's gaze slowly lifted to hers, and in her eyes now, beneath grief and bewilderment, was a quiet flame, a small, steady, human strength that emerges only when one has been wronged, and at last begins to know it. Miss Marple turned to the young man. You were right to come, and you must not be afraid now. You are not the one who wronged anyone. He nodded, swallowing tightly. What should I do? For now, Miss Marple said, in the same calm tone one might use to discuss arranging flowers. You should remain where others can see you. Do not leave the village. Do not confront Mr. Avery, and speak of this to no one but me. The young man nodded, relieved to be told what to hold still, rather than what to act upon. Miss Marple rose, shawl falling neatly around her shoulders. "I believe," she said, turning to Clara, "that we must visit Mr. Avery soon, but not yet. There is one thing I must see first." She stepped toward the door. Clara stood quickly. "What thing?" Miss Marple looked back at her with quiet gravity. "Harold's medical records." Clara's breath caught. "You think—" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that before a truth can be revealed, one must understand the precise shape of the lie." She opened the door to leave. The afternoon sunlight spilled across the threshold, bright and clear, but the air felt colder now, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple walked with a steady, unhurried grace, though her mind was moving swiftly. The village surgery lay just beyond the lane of chestnut trees, its whitewashed door standing open to the mild afternoon air. Inside, Dr. Whitcomb was arranging bottles in the cabinet, his spectacles perched precariously near the end of his nose. He was a small, tidy man, with a habit of rubbing his thumb along the edge of his mustache whenever uncertainty troubled him. "Miss Marple," he said, pleasantly surprised. "What can I do for you today? Not feeling unwell, I hope?" "Oh, no, nothing of the sort," Miss Marple said, smiling in that soft, gentle way of hers that disarmed suspicion with ease. "But I have come about Mrs. Vennings. You see, matters have arisen that make it rather important to understand the exact nature of her husband's final illness." Dr. Whitcomb paused, just briefly, but it was all Miss Marple required. His hand stopped mid-motion before he nodded, thoughtful. "Yes, Harold Vennings. A sad case, quiet decline, though not unexpected, given his condition." "His condition?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. The doctor hesitated again. Not long, not noticeably, but hesitation is rarely without meaning. "A weakening of the heart," he said. "A failure of circulation." He grew short of breath, lost color, that sort of thing. Miss Marple's tone remained pleasant. Yet I recall Harold Vennings to have been a man of quite good health, active, fond of walking, even after his retirement. "Yes," the doctor admitted slowly. "It did progress unusually fast. Some illnesses do." He cleared his throat, glasses slipping slightly. "Mrs. Vennings insisted on nursing him herself. She was very devoted. I visited often, but, well," he faded quickly. Miss Marple observed him with kind, unblinking eyes. "Doctor, might I see your notes from that period, just to ensure there is nothing overlooked? Mrs. Vennings has been deeply troubled. Sometimes clarity in records can ease a burdened mind." The request was framed as kindness, a balm, not suspicion. Dr. Whitcomb exhaled softly and nodded. "Yes, yes, of course, though I fear they will not tell you much." He went to retrieve the folder. When he returned, Miss Marple accepted it gently, opening it on the small examination table. There were notes of symptoms, dates, but something was missing. Not a single mention of prescribed medicines, no dosage records, no administration notes, as though Harold Vennings had simply declined into death on his own, which, Miss Marple knew very well, rarely happened without assistance, of one kind or another. "Did you prescribe him anything?" she asked, lightly as a passing comment. Dr. Whitcomb's expression tightened. His thumb brushed his mustache. "I recommended a tonic," he said, "but I did not oversee the dosage. She insisted she could manage." He stopped, then corrected himself, almost too quickly. Clara insisted." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Clara," she repeated, with such gentle concern that the doctor blanched. No, I misspoke," the doctor said quickly. "I meant Ronald Avery. He brought the tonic. Said he knew a supplier. A family remedy, he called it. He insisted it would help ease Harold's pain. I allowed it, reluctantly. Perhaps I should not have." Miss Marple closed the folder very carefully. A tonic, provided by Ronald Avery, administered in Clara's home. Harold weakening quickly afterward. Clara blamed herself. Ronald comforted her, and then arranged her affairs. It was all becoming very clear. But clarity must never be revealed too soon. The truth was still tender, and tender truths break if handled hastily. She left the surgery at the same calm pace she had entered. The sky was dimming now, early evening drawing its pale lavender curtain across the village. Windows glowed softly. The inn lamps flickered. A dog barked somewhere distant. She made her way back toward Rose Cottage. Clara would be waiting, and the young man, whose conscience had become their quiet ally, would remain nearby. But before she reached the gate, she noticed movement near the cottage path. Ronald Avery, standing perfectly still, watching the house, his face unreadable, but his posture rigid, alert, held the sharp stillness of a man who senses danger, but has not yet located its source. Miss Marple slowed her steps, adjusting her shawl as though merely arranging its fold. Ronald turned. Their eyes met. No greetings were exchanged, not a word, but in that brief, silent moment, the shape of the conflict became unmistakable. He now knew that someone was asking questions, and she now knew that he was afraid of the answers. Miss Marple continued walking, serene as ever, and as she did, she thought, "It is nearly time, but not quite." Ronald did not move from where he stood. He watched Miss Marple approach the gate of Rose Cottage, and for a moment the evening air felt held between them, still, cool, waiting. Then, with a faint tilt of his head, he turned and began walking away down the lane, his steps measured, almost too controlled. It was the walk of a man who had been observed, and who now needed to rethink his plans. Miss Marple entered the cottage quietly. Clara sat in her parlor, hands clasped tightly together, her posture one of someone bracing against an unseen blow. The young man was seated nearby, hat turning slowly between his fingers. Miss Marple closed the door behind her with careful gentleness. "I have spoken with Dr. Whitcomb," she said, moving closer. It seems Harold was given a tonic during his final days, not prescribed by the doctor, but provided by Mr. Avery. Clara's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest. "A tonic," she whispered. "He said it would help Harold sleep. He said it eased suffering." Miss Marple took a seat beside her, her voice steady and clear. "My dear, I believe Ronald Avery ensured Harold's suffering increased, quietly, slowly, in a manner that could be mistaken for illness. And when Harold grew weaker, he used your grief to bind you to him. The forged letter was never intended to comfort you. It was intended to remind you of your dependence, to keep you under his influence." Clara's face changed then. Not a dramatic shift, but a subtle and profound one. Something within her, buried beneath guilt and longing and loss, began to wake. Her eyes hardened, not into anger, but into understanding. "I trusted him," she said, but not with despair. With clarity. The young man looked up. "What happens now?" he asked, voice low. "Do we go to the police?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "Not yet." She held her teacup with both hands, as though warming herself with thought. "The police require proof, not suspicions, not behaviors. Proof must be revealed at the right moment, and I believe Ronald Avery will soon provide it himself." The young man frowned. Clara leaned closer. Miss Marple continued, her words calm and measured. "A man who commits such acts does not do so only once. There will be signs, documents, financial transfers, discrepancies, omissions, something he believed would remain unnoticed. something he is now likely very anxious to hide. Clara swallowed. And he knows. Someone is asking questions. Yes, Miss Marple said. And the moment a man like Ronald feels watched, he makes mistakes. The young man leaned forward, voice hushed. What must we do? Miss Marple placed her teacup down and folded her hands neatly. We will give him an opportunity to reveal himself, a very gentle one. Tomorrow afternoon, Clara, you will send word to Mr. Avery, asking him to come here. You will tell him you have found something of Harold's that you wish him to see. Clara blinked, startled. But I haven't. You will, Miss Marple said softly. Before his illness worsened, Harold wrote a final letter. Not the one Ronald manufactured, but a real one. The letter in which he spoke of fear. Our young friend here saw it. That means Ronald did not destroy it outright. He would not have risked discarding something handwritten by Harold. It will be hidden among Harold's papers, likely in the business files Ronald removed from this house. Clara stared at her, realization beginning to dawn. That means... Yes, Miss Marple said. Ronald Avery has kept evidence of his own wrongdoing, because he did not understand what Harold meant when he wrote it. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Clara sat up, straighter than she had been in months. I will ask him to come, she said. No tremor now, no hesitation, only a steady human resolve. Miss Marple nodded. Good. And when he arrives, I will be here, not as an accuser, not as a threat. She gave a small, serene smile, simply as someone pouring tea. The young man let out a shaky breath that sounded almost like relief. It was then that the clock on the mantel chimed the hour, soft, melodic, unassuming, but something had shifted in the cottage. Clara was no longer the one haunted. Ronald Avery would be. And Miss Marple, quiet, polite, delicate as lace, had begun to tighten the final threads of the net. The next morning arrived pale, and mist softened, the village quiet, except for the distant clatter of milk bottles and the first sparrows stirring in the hedges. Clara wrote the note exactly as Miss Marple suggested, simple, polite, with no trace of accusation. She requested that Ronald call in the afternoon, as she had found something of Harold's that might require his advice. There was no mention of distress, no hint of suspicion, only the voice of a widow who had always accepted guidance. Miss Marple watched her write it, offering no interference, only a steady presence that seemed to hold Clara upright. The young man delivered the note, his expression tight but controlled. He did not knock at Ronald's door. He slipped it quietly through the slot and walked on without looking back. Miss Marple approved. A man in turmoil leaves no convincing message. A man resolved leaves no trace of hesitation. The hours that followed were quiet, deliberately quiet. Clara moved through her home with a calm that surprised even her. She dusted the mantel. She changed the flowers in the vase. She straightened Harold's photograph, smoothing the frame. Not frantic, just careful, just present, as if reacquainting herself with the pieces of her life she had allowed someone else to arrange. Miss Marple sat knitting, her needles making soft tapping sounds that matched the slow rhythm of the house. Nothing was hurried today. The waiting was part of the work. Outside, the mist gradually lifted. The village moved about its small rituals. The bakery bell, the cart passing toward the green, but inside Rose Cottage, time seemed to draw its breath and hold. Then shortly after 3, footsteps sounded on the garden path. Clara's hand tightened on the arm of her chair, but Miss Marple merely smoothed her yarn and nodded once. The knock was gentle, almost genteel. Ronald Avery had always been polite. Clara opened the door herself. Ronald stood there, hat in hand, face composed with just the right touch of concern. But his eyes flickered, sharp, searching, taking in Clara's calm, the tidiness of the room beyond her, the faint drift of lavender tea. "Clara," he said warmly, "you wrote that you had found something of Harold's?" "Yes," Clara replied, stepping aside. "Come in. There is tea." Ronald entered. He saw Miss Marple seated near the window, her presence mild, harmless, grandmotherly, a lace shawl, knitting, a cup of tea. Someone who could not possibly threaten him. He barely acknowledged her. "Of course, Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "still offering your comfort." "How kind of you," Miss Marple smiled. "One tries. It is surprising how often the smallest attentions reveal the very largest truths." Ronald's expression flickered, only for an instant. But Miss Marple saw it. Clara spoke before the moment could settle. "I remembered the box of Harold's papers you took after his passing," she said. "I wondered if you might have noticed anything among them that seemed unfinished, something he may have started to write." Ronald paused, just long enough to betray that he knew exactly what she meant. But his voice was calm. "I sorted everything, Clara. You were in no state to deal with such matters. I assured you at the time there was nothing of significance." Miss Marple did not look up from her knitting. "A curious thing, though," she said. "Harold's handwriting was quite distinctive, was it not? A particular flourish at the end of his signature. The young often think handwriting cannot be duplicated. But one learns, living as long as I have, that imitation is only convincing when done by someone familiar with the hand, but not the mind." Ronald's hand tightened slightly around his hat. Clara watched him now, not as a woman seeking comfort, but as one seeing a man clearly for the first time. The room was very still. Ronald spoke again, voice just slightly too light. "I don't quite follow." Miss Marple gently set her knitting aside. "Harold knew something," she said softly, "something he feared, and he tried to write to Clara about it. That is the letter you sought to destroy. Yet you only copied its tone when forging the one sent last night. You knew his handwriting, but not his mind." Ronald's face went pale, but he did not speak. Miss Marple continued, her voice almost tender. "And that, Mr. Avery, was your mistake. For a man's handwriting may be imitated, but fear cannot. Harold's real letter is somewhere among the papers you removed, and now, fearing it may be found, you have come to retrieve what you believe still exists here." The silence that followed was colder than any winter wind. Ronald's composure did not break. Not yet, but his voice did. "You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled again, gentle as morning light. "Oh, my dear, I do not need to prove it. You will. When you realize that the letter is missing, you will go to find it, and we will be watching when you do." It was the smallest shift, the faintest tensing of his shoulders, the unmistakable sign of a man who knows he is trapped. Clara did not speak. She didn't need to. Ronald Avery set his hat slowly on the table. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. "You are playing a very foolish game, Miss Marple." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Oh, no," she replied softly. "I am merely watching one." The room felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The next move would not be made here. It would be made tonight, and Ronald Avery knew it. Ronald remained very still, his hat resting on the table like something placed there carefully to avoid noise. The afternoon light slanted across the parlor, gentle but unwavering, and in that soft light, his face seemed suddenly older, not worn, but strained, like a mask that had been held in place too long. Clara did not move. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her gaze clear. Not accusatory, not pleading, simply watching. It was this, her steadiness, that unsettled Ronald most. He rose slowly, smoothing his coat. "I suppose," he said lightly, "that we are all overwrought. Grief can produce the most extraordinary fancies. I shall return tomorrow, Clara, when we are all in clearer spirits." Clara said nothing. Miss Marple only dipped her head in a polite, almost grandmotherly nod. Ronald left the cottage. They waited until the garden gate clicked shut. The young man exhaled first, shoulders sagging. "He's rattled," he whispered. He didn't expect her to stand firm. "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. He expected her to lean on him. That was his assurance, his leverage. Clara's voice was quiet, but stronger than it had been in months. "He believed I needed him to understand my own grief." Miss Marple smiled, warm with approval. "Yes, my dear, and now he realizes that grief has given you clarity instead." The young man stood, restless. "He'll go for it. The letter. Wherever it is?" "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "He will not sleep tonight. He will feel the ground shifting beneath him, and men like Ronald cannot bear uncertain ground." She rose, tying her shawl carefully around her shoulders. "Clara, you must remain here. Lock your doors. The night may feel long, but fear will not harm you now. You are no longer the one being manipulated." Clara nodded, though a faint tremor passed through her. "I'll stay with her," the young man said. "I won't leave until morning." Miss Marple took a gentle look at him, one filled with quiet gratitude. "Good. That will ease her heart." Then she stepped outside. Dusk was beginning. The village was settling into lamplight and supper and the muted hush of evening. Smoke curled from chimneys. Curtains glowed softly. The world looked peaceful. But Miss Marple knew better. And tonight, the surface would stir. She walked toward the lane leading out of the village, the path that wound behind the post office and led toward the small rented rooms where Mr. Avery kept his business records. Her steps were quiet, her pace unhurried, as though she were merely out for evening air. There was no need to hurry. The important thing was to be early. She arrived just as the last of the daylight faded. The windows of the office were dark. The door was locked. She did not try it. Instead, she found a place to sit on a low stone wall beneath a yew tree, her shawl drawn close against the cool. She waited. The village clock chimed 9, then 10. The night deepened. At last, footsteps. Ronald emerged from the shadows of the lane, coat collar up, moving with the careful quickness of a man who believes he is unseen. He did not look around. He did not breathe loudly. He moved with purpose. He unlocked the office door. Miss Marple did not rise. She simply watched through the window. Inside, Ronald lit a lamp. He went to a cabinet first, then another, then the old desk at the back, where Harold's ledgers once sat neatly in rows. His movements grew faster, rougher. Papers pulled, boxes overturned, drawers emptied. He was searching for the letter. He believed it existed. He believed it could condemn him. He believed it had been here once, and in that belief, in that certainty, was the proof Miss Marple required. Not the letter itself, but the knowledge of it. The lamp inside flickered as Ronald slammed a drawer shut. Furious now, fear rising sharp beneath his skin, Miss Marple stood, quietly, calmly. She stepped to the open doorway. Ronald froze. She did not speak loudly. She did not accuse. "Mr. Avery," she said, in the softest tone, "only a man who knows a letter exists searches for it." Ronald stared at her. breath shallow. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost sorrowful, and only a man who fears what it contains would need to destroy it. His face crumpled, not dramatically, not with loud collapse, but with the quiet, defeated realization of a man who has been seen entirely. Miss Marple stepped just inside the doorway. "Harold did not die of illness," she said. "He died of trust." Ronald sank into the chair behind him, hands over his face. No one else was there. No policemen, no witnesses, no raised voices, just truth. And truth was enough. The village would wake tomorrow unchanged in appearance. Lamps lit, hedgerows clipped, tea poured as usual, but everything beneath would be different, as Miss Marple knew it would be. Ronald did not speak at first. His hands remained over his face, as though the simple act of being seen had stripped away every defense he had so carefully built. The lamplight in the small office flickered with a restless pulse, shadows trembling across the scattered papers on the floor. When he finally lowered his hands, his expression was neither angry nor indignant. It was tired in a way that suggested his struggle had begun long before Harold's death, and perhaps even before the tonic, before the ledgers, before the business had begun to falter. "You think you understand," he said quietly, not accusing, not mocking, simply stating. Miss Marple stepped forward just enough to be heard clearly, her voice a soft thread in the dim room. "I understand what matters." His eyes met hers. They were sharp once, calculating, but now they carried something hollowed out. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he murmured. "Harold was kind, foolishly kind. I tried to keep the business afloat, tried to cover the debts he didn't even know we had. He trusted the wrong people. He trusted me." Miss Marple listened, her face calm, her gaze steady. Ronald's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk. "When I brought him the tonic, I thought, only rest, only peace, only a slowing, not an end." But the sentence hung unfinished. It did not need finishing. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was made of gentleness, not forgiveness, but understanding of the complexity of human failing. "Harold feared you in the end," she said, "not for what you might do to him, but for what guilt might drive you to do next." Ronald closed his eyes. "He wrote the letter," he whispered. "I didn't destroy it because I thought, if anyone saw it, they would pity me, or condemn me, or both." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And yet, you could not let Clara remember him with peace either." His expression tightened, the last piece of truth rising. She was going to sell the last of his shares. "I needed her to trust me long enough to complete the deal. The letter was only meant to unsettle her, keep her near, keep her listening." "And in doing so," Miss Marple said quietly, "you revealed everything you had hoped to bury." The room was silent for a long time. Outside, the village was dark and still. The world did not know yet that a truth had been laid open. Ronald sat back in the chair, the weight of inevitability settling across his shoulders. "What will you do now?" he asked. Miss Marple did not answer right away. Instead, she gathered the scattered papers from the floor with careful, unhurried movements, as one tidies the final remnants of a story that has already ended. When she spoke, her tone remained soft. "I will walk to the constable's house tonight, slowly, so that you may choose what to say before I arrive." Ronald's eyes flickered, not with hope, but with something like acceptance. "You're giving me time." "Everyone deserves at least that," Miss Marple replied, "even those who have taken time from others." She moved toward the door. Ronald did not follow. He did not plead. He simply sat there, as though for the first time in months, perhaps years, he no longer needed to pretend. Outside, the night air was cool, touched with the scent of damp earth and distant chimney smoke. The path toward the constable's cottage stretched ahead, quiet and unhurried. Miss Marple walked, not triumphant, not burdened, simply thoughtful, for she knew that every tragedy in a village such as this was born not from grand evil, but from the soft human frailties that lived in every heart. At Rose Cottage, Clara slept, finally, her breath steady, no longer tangled with guilt. The village would wake tomorrow and speak in whispers, as it always did, but Miss Marple, knitting once more at her window, would simply watch the morning come, for the world had shifted again, just slightly, as it always does. Miss Marple did not walk quickly. There was no need. The constable's cottage sat just beyond the bend in the quiet lane, its windows lit by the warm, steady glow of a single oil lamp. The night was very still. A faint scent of wood smoke lingered, and the soft rustle of hedges in the breeze accompanied her footsteps like a thoughtful whisper. She knew, of course, that Ronald would not run. He was not a man who fled. His life, his mistakes, his guilt, they were all rooted here, and once a man has bound himself to a place through fear and longing, escape becomes impossible, even with the road clear before him. When she reached the constable's gate, she paused, smoothing a fold in her shawl. Inside, a kettle whistled, a quiet domestic sound, as though the night held no secrets at all. She knocked. Constable Finch, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a perpetual air of being slightly overwhelmed, opened the door. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression shifted at once to concern. "Miss Marple, at this hour, there's nothing amiss, I hope. There is something we must discuss," she said gently. "It concerns Harold Vennings and Ronald Avery." Finch blinked, then stepped aside at once. Inside, Miss Marple recounted the events, not dramatically, not accusingly, but in the calm, ordered sequence of truth. Finch listened, brow furrowed deeper and deeper, his breath drawing tight in his chest. "He poisoned him." The words came out rough, like something dragged up from beneath a heavy weight. Slowly, and then forged the letter, and meant to keep control of her. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, but you must understand his guilt is not only of malice. Fear drove him, and desperation, but wrongdoing is wrongdoing, whatever its shape." Finch rose from his chair and took his coat from the peg. His movements were not hurried, only steady. He understood now the seriousness and the sorrow of what lay ahead. "Will he come quietly?" Finch asked. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "He has already begun to accept the truth of what he has done. He sits with it now." Finch nodded once, a solemn nod. Then he left, lantern in hand. Miss Marple did not join him. She turned back toward the lane, choosing to walk the long way home. The night air felt cool against her cheeks, and the stars scattered overhead like faint silver embroidery on a dark velvet cloth. When she reached Rose Cottage again, the house was dark, except for a single lamp in the front window. The young man sat in a chair just inside, keeping watch. Clara slept in the next room, the tear tracks on her face dried, her breathing even and deep. A long-awaited quiet. Miss Marple gave the young man a small nod, no explanation needed, and he relaxed, just slightly, as though a tightness in the air had loosened. She settled once more into her place by the window, her knitting basket beside her. Her needles clicked softly in the stillness, not hurried, not tense, simply moving. Outside, she saw Constable Finch walk toward the office, lantern glowing, a lone figure in the quiet village night. He entered. He did not need to force the door. Ronald was sitting exactly as she had left him. No struggle, no protest, just the soft exhale of a man who had reached the end of the line he had drawn for himself long ago. They walked out together. The village slept. Miss Marple knitted, not because she needed to, but because life goes on, gently threading itself back into place. And tomorrow the sun would rise over High Meadow. The hedges would glisten with dew. The church bell would ring as always, and Clara Vennings would wake to a world in which grief no longer meant confusion. The village would whisper, of course. It always did. But somewhere in those whispers would be something softer, recognition, and perhaps a little gratitude for the small, quiet lady in the window who noticed what others did not. Miss Marple rose a little earlier than usual the next morning. Dawn had come quietly, with pale light filtering through the curtains and the faint sound of bird song in the hedgerows. The village still felt hushed, like a place that knew something had changed, but did not yet know how to speak of it. She made her tea and sat by the window, watching the first villagers step into the morning. Mrs. Pembroke was already sweeping her front steps. Mr. Fletcher opened the grocer's. Life resumed, as life always did. By mid-morning the news had begun to circulate. It did not race. It drifted, spreading gently through doorways and across shop counters. Ronald Avery had been taken into custody. There was talk of Harold Vennings' final days, of the tonic, of misplaced trust. But even as the story traveled from person to person, something in the telling had shifted. It was not a tale of scandal. Not entirely. It was something quieter, sadder, more human. Clara Vennings emerged from Rose Cottage just as the church bell rang the hour. She wore a dark, simple coat and held her head not proudly, but steadily. People stopped her gently, touching her arm, speaking softly, offering warmth rather than curiosity. Clara had suffered enough. The village understood that much. She walked to Miss Marple's door and tapped lightly. Miss Marple welcomed her inside without a word. They sat together for a moment, the silence soft, not heavy. Harold loved deeply, Clara said finally. He trusted deeply, too. Sometimes that is a dangerous gift. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes warm. Yes, my dear. But it is also the bravest one. Clara looked down at her hands, so still now, no longer trembling. I keep thinking of that letter, she whispered. The real one, the one he wrote before he died. He meant for you to understand, Miss Marple said gently, not to suffer. His fear was not of death, but of the burden he believed he might leave you with. He wished to protect you, even then. Clara closed her eyes, letting that truth settle into place. And Ronald? She asked quietly. Miss Marple spoke in her calm, steady way. Ronald Avery allowed desperation to grow into something darker. He believed he could manage consequences by controlling others. But guilt is like a shadow. It lengthens the longer one stands still. Clara breathed out once, long and slow. I am not angry, she said. Not now, only tired, and perhaps ready to live quietly, not in grief, just quietly. Miss Marple smiled, the soft kind of smile that carries understanding. That will be enough. And more. Clara reached across the table, not for comfort, but in gratitude, and Miss Marple squeezed her hand lightly in return. After Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her window seat. The village moved gently outside, the sound of footsteps on cobblestone, the distant ring of a bicycle bell, the soft voice of Mrs. Chatterby calling to her cat. High Meadow was still itself, but now the quiet held something wiser. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, the yarn slipping smoothly between her fingers. Her gaze wandered once more to the world beyond her window, not searching, not watching, simply seeing. Ordinary lives, ordinary sorrows, ordinary joys, but she knew, as she always did, that behind every curtain, every face, every small village moment, there were stories, some tender, some hidden, some dangerous, and she also knew that when the next one came, as it surely would, she would be ready, not with force, not with judgment, but with the gentle, unyielding clarity that comes from truly seeing people. The needles clicked softly, the morning sun grew warm, and the village breathed onward.